Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. Do you find your mind troubled with the stresses of modern life, especially when the lights are out and you're trying to get a restful night? Does your spinning mind keep you awake? Follow my voice down the path towards a good night's rest. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to daytime problems, the ones you can't solve right now and will be easier to solve while resting. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns of the story, but slowly letting go and drifting into sleep. Let my voice wash over you at a comfortable volume and allow yourself to be distracted from the stresses and worries that play on your mind. Whether you need help falling asleep or going back to sleep in the middle of the night, you can trust me to keep you company and help you to wake up tomorrow in a rested state. You may need to try out Sleepy Time Tales for a few nights to get used to the slightly strange idea, but I believe it will be well worth your while. I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So settle down, relax, and allow yourself to get lost in my telling of tonight's story. Before we get to tonight's reading, I'd like to ask for a few minutes of your time. Sleepy Time Tales is a listener-supported podcast. I can only keep it going, paying for the services and tools I use, and justify the time that I use on it thanks to the generosity of listeners like you. So if you're finding Sleepy Time Tales useful, if it helps you to get a restful night, and you would like to keep it going out to thousands of your fellow insomniacs, please consider supporting it on the Patreon at patreon.com/sleepytimetales. This is monthly support that not only helps me keep the lights on, but can get you bonuses based on your contribution level. So go along there, take a look, and sign up if you're willing and interested. And if monthly is a bigger ask, which is completely understandable, you can make once-off tips to the tip jar on the website at sleepytimetales.net. And if you'd like to help the show out without having to do so financially, you can just tell people about it. If you help me reach new audiences, you help the show go, and that's really even more than I can ask for. So that's enough of that, I think. Let's pick up where we left off at the end of one of Gatsby's great parties. Return this week to The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Rather ashamed that on my first appearance I had stayed so late, I joined the last of Gatsby's guests, who were clustered around him. I wanted to explain that I'd hunted for him early in the evening and to apologize for not having known him in the garden. "Don't mention it," he enjoined me eagerly. "Don't give it another thought, old sport." The familiar expression held no more familiarity than the hand which reassuringly brushed my shoulder. "And don't forget, we're going up in the hydroplane tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Then the butler, behind his shoulder. "Philadelphia wants you on the phone, sir." "All right, in a minute. Tell them I'll be right there. Good night. Good night. Good night." He smiled, and there suddenly seemed to be a pleasant significance in having been among the last to go, as if he had desired it all the time. "Good night, old sport, good night." But as I walked down the steps, I saw that the evening was not quite over. 50 feet from the door, a dozen headlights illuminated a bizarre and tumultuous scene. In the ditch beside the road, right side up but violently shorn of one wheel, rested a new coupe, which had left Gatsby's drive not 2 minutes before. The sharp jut of a wall accounted for the detachment of the wheel, which was now getting considerable attention from half a dozen curious chauffeurs. However, as they left their cars blocking the road, a harsh, discordant din from those in the rear had been audible for some time, and added to the already violent confusion of the scene. A man in a long duster had dismounted from the wreck, and now stood in the middle of the road, looking from the car to the tire, and from the tire to the observers in a pleasant, puzzled way. "See," he explained, It went in the ditch. The fact was infinitely astonishing to him, and I recognized first the unusual quality of wonder, and then the man. It was the late patron of Gatsby's library. How'd it happen? He shrugged his shoulders. I know nothing whatever about mechanics, he said decisively. But how did it happen? Did you run into the wall? Don't ask me, said Owl Eyes, washing his hands of the whole matter. I know very little about driving. Next to nothing. It happened, and that's all I know. Well, if you're a poor driver, you oughtn't to try driving at night. But I wasn't even trying, he explained indignantly. I wasn't even trying. An awed hush fell upon the bystanders. Do you want to commit suicide? You're lucky it was just a wheel. A bad driver and not even trying. You don't understand, explained the criminal. I wasn't driving. There's another man in the car. The shock that followed this declaration found voice in a sustained ah as the door of the coupe swung slowly open. The crowd, it was now a crowd, stepped back involuntarily, and when the door had opened wide there was a ghostly pause. Then very gradually, part by part, a pale, dangling individual stepped out of the wreck, pawing tentatively at the ground with a large, uncertain, dancing shoe. Blinded by the glare of the headlights and confused by the incessant groaning of horns, the apparition stood swaying for a moment before he perceived the man in the duster. What's the matter? He inquired calmly. Did we run out of gas? Look. Half a dozen fingers pointed at the amputated wheel. He stared at it for a moment, and then looked upward as though he suspected that it had dropped from the sky. It came off, someone explained. He nodded. At first I didn't notice we'd stopped. A pause. Then, taking a long breath and straightening his shoulders, he remarked in a determined voice. Wonder if they'll tell me there's a gas line station. At least a dozen men, some of them a little better off than he was, explained to him that the wheel and the car were no longer joined by any physical bond. Back out, he suggested after a moment. Put her in reverse. But the wheel's off. He hesitated. No harm in trying, he said. The caterwauling horns had reached a crescendo, and I turned away and cut across the lawn toward home. I glanced back once. A wafer of a moon was shining over Gatsby's house, making the night fine as before, and surviving the laughter and the sound of his still glowing garden. A sudden emptiness seemed to flow now from the windows and the great doors, endowing with complete isolation the figure of the host who stood on the porch, his hand up in a formal gesture of farewell. Reading over what I've written so far, I see I have given the impression that the events of 3 nights, several weeks apart, were all that absorbed me. On the contrary, they were merely casual events in a crowded summer, and until much later they absorbed me infinitely less than my personal affairs. Most of the time I worked. In the early morning, the sun threw my shadow westward as I hurried down the white chasms of lower New York to the Probity Trust. I knew the other clerks and young bond salesmen by their first names, and lunched with them in dark, crowded restaurants on little pig sausages and mashed potatoes and coffee. I even had a short affair with a girl who lived in Jersey City and worked in the accounting department. But her brother began throwing mean looks in my direction, so when she went on her vacation in July, I let it blow quietly away. I took dinner usually at the Yale Club. For some reason, it was the gloomiest event of my day, and then I went upstairs to the library and studied investments and securities for conscientious hour. There were generally a few rioters around, but they never came into the library, so it was a good place to work. After that, if the night was mellow, I strolled down Madison Avenue past the old Murray Hill Hotel and over 33rd Street to the Pennsylvania Station. I began to like New York, the racy, adventurous feel of it at night, and the satisfaction that the constant flicker of men and women and machines gives to the restless eye. I like to walk up Fifth Avenue and pick out romantic women from the crowd, and imagine that in a few minutes I was going to enter into their lives, and no one would know or disapprove. Sometimes in my mind I followed them to their apartments or in corners of hidden streets, and they turned and smiled back at me before they faded through a door into a warm darkness. At the enchanted metropolitan twilight I felt a haunting loneliness sometimes, and felt it in others. Poor young clerks who loitered in front of windows waiting until it was time for a solitary restaurant dinner. Young clerks in the dusk, wasting the most poignant moments of night and life. Again at 8 o'clock, when the dark lanes of the 40s were lined 5 deep with throbbing taxicabs, bound for the theatre district, I felt a sinking in my heart. Forms leaned together in the taxis as they waited, and voices sang, and there was laughter from unheard jokes, and lighted cigarettes made unintelligible circles inside. Imagining that I too was hurrying towards gaiety and sharing their intimate excitement, I wished them well. For a while I lost sight of Jordan Baker, and then in midsummer I found her again. At first I was flattered to go places with her, because she was a golf champion and everyone knew her name. Then it was something more. I wasn't actually in love, but I felt a sort of tender curiosity. The bored, haughty face that she turned to the world concealed something. Most affectations conceal something eventually, even though they don't in the beginning. And one day I found what it was. When we were on a house party together up in Warwick, she left a borrowed car out in the rain with the top down and then lied about it. And suddenly I remembered the story about her that had eluded me that night at Daisy's. At her first big golf tournament, there was a row that nearly reached the newspapers. A suggestion that she had moved her ball from a bad lie in the semi-final round. The thing approached the proportions of a scandal, then died away. A caddy retracted his statement, and the only other witness admitted that he might have been mistaken. The incident and the name had remained together in my mind. Jordan Baker instinctively avoided clever, shrewd men, and now I saw that this was because she felt safer on a plane, where any divergence from a code would be thought impossible. She was incurably dishonest. She wasn't able to endure being at a disadvantage, and given this unwillingness, I suppose she had begun dealing in subterfuges when she was very young, in order to keep that cool, insolent smile turned to the world, and yet satisfy the demands of a hard, jaunty body. It made no difference to me. Dishonesty in a woman is a thing you never blame deeply. I was casually sorry, and then I forgot. It was on that same house party that we had a curious conversation about driving a car. It started because she passed so close to some workmen that our fender flicked a button on one man's coat. "You're a rotten driver," I protested. "Either you are to be more careful or you oughtn't to drive at all." "I am careful." "No, you're not." "Well, other people are," she said lightly. "What's that got to do with it?" "They'll keep out of my way," she insisted. "It takes two to make an accident. Suppose you meet somebody just as careless as yourself." "I hope I never will," she answered. "I hate careless people. That's why I like you." Her grey, sun-strained eyes stared straight ahead, but she had deliberately shifted our relations. And for a moment I thought I loved her. But I'm slow-thinking and full of interior rules that act as brakes on my desires. And I knew that first I had to get myself definitely out of that tangle back home. I had been writing letters once a week and signing them "Love Nick," and all I could think of was how, when that certain girl played tennis, a faint moustache of perspiration appeared on her upper lip. Nevertheless, there was a vague understanding that had to be tactfully broken off before I was free. Everyone suspects himself of at least one of the cardinal virtues, and this is mine. I am one of the few honest people that I have ever known. 4. On Sunday morning, while church bells rang in the villages along shore, the world and its mistress returned to Gatsby's house and twinkled hilariously on his lawn. "He's a bootlegger," said the young ladies, moving somewhere between his cocktails and his flowers. "One time he killed a man who found out he was nephew to von Hindenburg and second cousin to the devil. Reach me a rose, honey, and pour me a last drop into that there crystal glass." Once I wrote down on the empty spaces of a timetable the names of those who came to Gatsby's house that summer. It is an old timetable now, disintegrating at its folds, and headed, "This schedule in effect, July 5th, 1922. But I can still read the grey names, and they will give you a better impression than my generalities of those who accepted Gatsby's hospitality and paid him the subtle tribute of knowing nothing whatever about him. From Easter Egg then came the Chesterbeckers and the Leaches, and a man named Bunsen, whom I knew at Yale, and a Dr. Webster Civet, who was drowned last summer up in Maine, and the Hornbeams and the Willie Voltaires, and a whole clan named Blackbuck, who always gathered in a corner and flipped up their noses like goats at whosoever came near, and the Ismays and the Christies, or rather Hubert Orbach and Mr. Christie's wife, and Edgar Beaver, whose hair, they say, turned cotton white one winter afternoon, for no good reason at all. Clarence Sondive was from an East Egg, as I remember. He came only once, in white knickerbockers, and had a fight with a bum named Etty in the garden. From further out on the island came the Cheadles, and the O.R.P. Schraders, and the Stonewall Jackson Abrams of Georgia, and the Fishguards, and the Ripley Snells. Snell was there 3 days before he went to the penitentiary, so drunk out on the gravel drive that Mrs. Ulysses Sewett's automobile ran over his right hand. The Danceys came too, and S.B. Whitebait, who was well over 60, and Maurice A. Flink, and the Hammerheads, and Beluga the tobacco importer, and Beluga's girls. From West Egg came the Poles, and the Mulreadys, and Cecil Roebuck, and Cecil Shuren, and Gulick, the state senator, and Newton Orchard, who controlled films par excellence, and Eckhart, and Clyde Cohen, and Don S. Schwartz, the son, and Arthur McCarty, all connected with the movies in one way or another, and the Catlips, and the Bembergs, and G. Earl Muldoon, brother to that Muldoon who afterwards strangled his wife. De Fontano, the promoter, came there, and Eglegros and James B., Rotgut Ferret, and the De Jongs and Ernest Lilly. They came to gamble, and when Ferret wandered into the garden, it meant he was cleaned out, and associated traction would have to fluctuate profitably the next day. A man named Klipspringer was there so often that he became known as the Boarder. I doubt if he had any other home. Of theatrical people, there were Gus Ways and Horace O'Donovan and Lester Meyer and George Duckweed and Francis Bull. Also from New York were the Chromes and the Backisons, and the Dennisons and Russell Betty, and the Corrigans and the Killahers and the Dewars and the Scullys and S.W. Belcher and the Smirks and the Young Quinns, divorced now, and Henry L. Palmetto, who killed himself by jumping in front of a subway train in Times Square. Benny McLennan arrived always with 4 girls. They were never quite the same ones in physical person, but they were so identical with one another that it inevitably seemed they had been there before. I have forgotten their names. Jacqueline, I think, was Consuela, or Gloria, or Judy, or June, and their last names were either the melodious names of flowers and months, or the sterner ones of the great American capitalists, whose cousins, if pressed, they would confess themselves to be. In addition to all of these, I can remember that Faustina O'Brien came there at least once, and the Baedeker girls and young Brewer, who had his nose shot off in the war, and Mr. Ulbrichsberger and Miss Hag, his fiancée, and Ardita Fitzpeters, and Mr. P. Jewett, once head of the American Legion, and Miss Claudia Hip, with a man reputed to be her chauffeur, and a prince of something, whom we called Duke, and his name, if I ever knew it, I've forgotten. All these people came to Gatsby's house in the summer. At 9 o'clock, one morning late in July, Gatsby's gorgeous car lurched up the rocky drive to my door and gave out a burst of melody from its three-noted horn. It was the first time he had called on me, though I had gone to 2 of his parties, mounted in his hydroplane and, at his urgent invitation, made frequent use of his beach. "Good morning, old sport. You're having lunch with me today, and I thought we'd ride up together." He was balancing himself on the dashboard of his car with that resourcefulness of movement that is so peculiarly American. That comes, I suppose, with the absence of lifting work in youth, and even more with the formless grace of our nervous, sporadic games. This quality was continually breaking through his punctilious manner in the shape of restlessness. He was never quite still. There was always a tapping foot somewhere or an impatient opening and closing of a hand. He saw me looking with admiration at his car. "It's pretty, isn't it, old sport?" He jumped off to give me a better view. "Haven't you ever seen it before?" I'd seen it. Everybody had seen it. It was a rich cream color, bright with nickel, swollen here and there in its monstrous length with triumphant hat boxes and supper boxes and toolboxes, and terraced with a labyrinth of windshields that mirrored a dozen suns. Sitting down behind many layers of glass in a sort of green leather conservatory, we started to town. I had talked with him perhaps half a dozen times in the past month, and found to my disappointment that he had little to say. So my first impression, that he was a person of some undefined consequence, had gradually faded, and he had become simply the proprietor of an elaborate roadhouse next door. And then came that disconcerting ride. We hadn't reached West Egg Village before Gatsby began leaving his elegant sentences unfinished, and slapping himself indecisively on the knee of his caramel-colored suit. "Look here, old sport," he broke out surprisingly. "What's your opinion of me anyhow?" A little overwhelmed, I began the generalized evasions which that question deserves. "Well, I'm going to tell you something about my life," he interrupted. "I don't want you to get the wrong idea of me from all these stories you hear." So he was aware of the bizarre accusations that flavored conversations in his halls. "I'll tell you the God's truth." His right hand suddenly ordered divine retribution to stand by. "I'm the son of some wealthy people in the Middle West, all dead now. I was brought up in America but educated at Oxford, all because my ancestors had been educated there for many years. It's a family tradition." He looked at me sideways, and I knew why Jordan Baker had believed he was lying. He hurried the phrase, "educated at Oxford," or swallowed it, or choked on it, as though it had bothered him before. And with this start, his whole statement fell to pieces, and I wondered if there wasn't something a little sinister about him after all. "What part of the Middle West?" I inquired casually. "San Francisco." "I see. My family all died, and I came into a good deal of money." His voice was solemn, as if the memory of that sudden extinction of a clan still haunted him. For a moment I suspected that he was pulling my leg, but a glance at him convinced me otherwise. After that I lived like a young Raja in all the capitals of Europe. Paris, Venice, Rome, collecting jewels, chiefly rubies, hunting big game, painting a little, things for myself only, and trying to forget something very sad that had happened to me long ago. With an effort, I managed to restrain my incredulous laughter. The very phrases were worn so threadbare that they evoked no image except of a turbaned character, leaking sawdust at every pore, as he pursued a tiger through the Bois de Boulogne. Then came the war, old sport. It was a great relief, and I tried very hard to die. But I seemed to bear an enchanted life. I accepted a commission as first lieutenant when it began. In the Algon forest, I took the remains of my machine gun battalion so far forward that there was a half-mile gap on either side of us where the infantry couldn't advance. We stayed there 2 days and 2 nights, 130 men with 16 Lewis guns. And when the infantry came up at last, they found the insignia of 3 German divisions among the piles of dead. I was promoted to be a major, and every Allied government gave me a decoration. Even Montenegro. Little Montenegro down on the Adriatic Sea. Little Montenegro. He lifted up the words and nodded at them with his smile. The smile comprehended Montenegro's troubled history and sympathized with the brave struggles of the Montenegrin people. It appreciated fully the chain of national circumstances which had elicited this tribute from Montenegro's warm little heart. My incredulity was submerged in fascination now. It was like skimming hastily through a dozen magazines. He reached in his pocket, and a piece of metal slung on a ribbon fell into my palm. That's the one from Montenegro. To my astonishment, the thing had an authentic look. Orderi de Danilo, ran the circular legend. Montenegro Nicholas Rex. Turn it. Major J. Gatsby, I read, for valor extraordinary. Here's another thing I always carry. A souvenir of Oxford days. It was taken in Trinity Quad. The man on my left is now the Earl of Doncaster. It was a photograph of half a dozen young men in blazers loafing in an archway, through which were visible a host of spires. There was Gatsby, looking a little, not much, younger, with a cricket bat in his hand. Then it was all true. I saw the skins of tigers flaming in his palace on the Grand Canal. I saw him opening a chest of rubies to ease, with their crimson-lighted depths, the gnawing of his broken heart. I'm going to make a big request of you today, he said, pocketing his souvenirs with satisfaction. So I thought you ought to know something about me. I don't want you to think I was just some nobody. You see, I usually find myself among strangers because I drift here and there, trying to forget the sad things that happened to me. He hesitated. You'll hear about it this afternoon. At lunch? No, this afternoon. I happened to find out that you're taking Miss Baker to tea. Do you mean you're in love with Miss Baker? No, old sport, I'm not. But Miss Baker has kindly consented to speak to you about this matter. I hadn't the faintest idea what this matter was, but I was more annoyed than interested. I hadn't asked Jordan to tea in order to discuss Mr. J. Gatsby. I was sure the request would be something utterly fantastic, and for a moment I was sorry I'd ever set foot upon his overpopulated lawn. He wouldn't say another word. His correctness grew on him as we neared the city. We passed Port Roosevelt, where there was a glimpse of red-belted ocean-going ships, and sped along a cobbled slum lined with dark, undeserted saloons of faded gilt 1900s. Then the Valley of Ashes opened out on both sides of us, and I had a glimpse of Mrs. Wilson straining at the garage pump, with panting vitality as we went by. With fenders spread like wings, we scattered light through half Astoria. Only half, for as we twisted among the pillars of the elevated, I heard the familiar jug-jug spat of a motorcycle, and a frantic policeman rode alongside. " 'All right, old sport,' called Gatsby. We slowed down. Taking a white card from his wallet, he waved it before the man's eyes. Right you are, agreed the policeman, tipping his cap. Know you next time, Mr. Gatsby. Excuse me. What was that, I inquired. The picture of Oxford? I was able to do the commissioner a favor once, and he sends me a Christmas card every year. Over the great bridge, with the sunlight through the girders, making a constant flicker upon the moving cars, with the city rising up across the river in white heaps and sugar lumps, all built with a wish out of Knoll factory money. The city seen from the Queensborough Bridge is always the city seen for the first time, in its first wild promise of all mystery, and the beauty in the world. A dead man passed us in a hearse heaped with blooms, followed by 2 carriages with drawn blinds, and by more cheerful carriages for friends. The friends looked out at us with the tragic eyes and short upper lips of southeastern Europe, and I was happy that the sight of Gatsby's splendid car was included in their somber holiday. As we crossed Blackwell's Island, a limousine passed us, driven by a white chauffeur. Anything can happen now that we've slid over this bridge, I thought. Anything at all. Even Gatsby could happen, without any particular wonder. Roaring noon. In a well-fanned 42nd Street cellar, I met Gatsby for lunch. Blinking away the brightness of the street outside, my eyes picked him out obscurely in the anteroom, talking to another man. Mr. Carraway, this is my friend Mr. Wolfsheim. A small flat-nosed man raised his head and regarded me with 2 fine growths of hair, which luxuriated in either nostril. After a moment, I discovered his tiny eyes in the half-darkness. So I took one look at him, said Mr. Wolfsheim, shaking my hand earnestly. And what do you think I did? What? I inquired politely. But evidently he was not addressing me, for he dropped my hand and covered Gatsby with his expressive nose. I handed the money to Catspaw and I said, All right, Catspaw, don't pay him a penny till he shuts his mouth. He shut it then and there. Gatsby took an arm of each of us and moved forward into the restaurant, whereupon Mr. Wolfsheim swallowed a new sentence he was starting, and lapsed into somnambulatory abstraction. Highballs, asked the head waiter. This is a nice restaurant here, said Mr. Wolfsheim, looking at the Presbyterian nymphs on the ceiling. But I like across the street better. Yes, highballs, agreed Gatsby. And then to Mr. Wolfsheim, it's too hot over there. Hot and small, yes, said Mr. Wolfsheim, but full of memories. What place is that? I asked. The old Metropole. The old Metropole, brooded Mr. Wolfsheim gloomily. Filled with faces dead and gone. Filled with friends gone now forever. I can't forget so long as I live the night they shot Rosie Rosenthal there. It was 6 of us at the table, and Rosie had eaten and drunk a lot all evening. When it was almost morning, the waiter came up to him with a funny look and said somebody wants to speak to him outside. All right, says Rosie, and begins to get up, and I pulled him down in his chair. Let the bastards come in here if they want you, Rosie, but don't you, so help me, move out of this room. It was 4 o'clock in the morning then, and if we'd have raised the blinds, we'd have seen daylight. Did he go? I asked innocently. Sure he went. Mr. Wolfsheim's rose flashed at me indignantly. He turned around in the door and says, Don't let that waiter take away my coffee. Then he went out on the sidewalk and they shot him 3 times in this full belly and drove away. 4 of them were electrocuted, I said, remembering. 5, with Becker. His nostrils turned to me in an interested way. I understand you're looking for a business connection. The juxtaposition of these 2 remarks was startling. Gatsby answered for me, Oh no, this isn't the man. No, Mr. Wolfsheim seemed disappointed. This is just a friend. I told you we'd talk about that some other time. I beg your pardon, said Mr. Wolfsheim. I had a wrong man. A succulent hash arrived, and Mr. Wolfsheim, forgetting the more sentimental atmosphere of the old metropole, began to eat with ferocious delicacy. His eyes, meanwhile, roved very slowly all round the room. He completed the arc by turning to inspect the people directly behind. I think that, except for my presence, he would have taken one short glance beneath our own table. Look here, old sport, said Gatsby, leaning toward me. I'm afraid I made you a little angry this morning in the car. There was the smile again, but this time I held out against it. I don't like mysteries, I answered, and I don't understand why you won't come out frankly and tell me what you want. Why has it all got to come through Miss Baker? Oh, it's nothing underhand, he assured me. Miss Baker's a great sportswoman, you know, and she'd never do anything that isn't all right. Suddenly he looked up at his watch, jumped up and hurried from the room, leaving me with Mr. Wolfsheim at the table. He has to telephone, said Mr. Wolfsheim, following him with his eyes. Fine fellow, isn't he? Handsome to look at and a perfect gentleman. Yes. He's an Oxford man. Oh. He went to Oxford College in England. You know Oxford College? I've heard of it. It's one of the most famous colleges in the world. Have you known Gatsby for a long time, I inquired. Several years, he answered in a gratified way. I made the pleasure of his acquaintance just after the war, but I knew I had discovered a man of fine breeding after I talked with him an hour. I said to myself, this is the kind of man you'd like to take home and introduce to your mother and sister. He paused. I see you're looking at my cuff buttons. I hadn't been looking at them, but I did now. They were composed of oddly familiar pieces of ivory. Finest specimens of human molars, he informed me. Well, I inspected them. That's a very interesting idea. Yeah. He flipped his sleeves up under his coat. Yeah, Gatsby's very careful about women. He would never so much as look at a man's wife. And I think I'm going to leave it on that slightly odd note. If you'd like to pick up where I've left off, you can, as always, find the original on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes. Just be warned, there's some slightly strange, racist, and slightly anti-Semitic stuff that I'll filter out as I'm going. You kind of forget that this sort of stuff was endemic 100 years ago, but probably still worth a read. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepytime Tales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to follow or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so that you get the new episodes whenever they come out. Good night and sweet dreams.